Good evening, Forest community members, and welcome to our Forest Focus webinar this evening. Can't believe that this is our last webinar before half term. Time has really flown. As always, we're not expecting any technical difficulties, but please do bear with us if we encounter any problems. If you could also be kind enough to please complete our feedback survey, so we are always improving what we do, that would be great. This will be displayed as a QR code once our speaker has finished this evening at the end of the webinar. Also, please do join us on Wednesday the 15th of November for our next webinar focused on faith, belief and identity, why skills for dialogue matter. This is held during our whole school Interfaith Week. Momentarily, I will be introducing our guest speaker tonight, who will be discussing how to have conversations about consent with your children. As head of RSHE at Forest, I can tell you that consent is discussed in each year group in a way that is age and stage appropriate, so all pupils are aware of what this entails. I also wanted to let you know that we are hoping to hold an RFHE Insight webinar regarding strategy and curriculum in due course. However, we will only be able to update you once the governmental review has been carried out, and that's due to be completed by the end of this year. So hopefully some dates for your diary and things to look out for in the future. So without further ado, I would like to give a brief introduction to our speaker this evening, Monica Bhogal. Monica is the director of the Schools Consent Project, a charity which sends lawyers into schools to teach 11 to 18-year-olds the legal definitions of consent and key sexual offences, such as rape, sexual assault and sexting, through interactive workshops. She practiced as a solicitor for 15 years, specialising in defamation and privacy claims. She is also the parent of 2 teenagers. Monica is passionate about educating and empowering young people by ensuring they have accurate and comprehensive knowledge to enable them to enjoy respectful, fulfilling relationships. By making the next generation confident of their legal rights, able to communicate their boundaries, and respectful of those boundaries in others, she believes we can support the wider cultural change that we are all looking to achieve, not just in our schools, but in our society as a whole. I will now hand over to Monica. Monica, welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me this evening and for the lovely intro as well. I hope everyone enjoyed the hold music as well. I particularly enjoyed that part of it. I am going to speak to you as parents about consent and conversations around consent that we can have with our children at home. As Miss Arthur just explained, I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, one who is now officially an adult, but I've been having these conversations with my children since they were probably around 9 and 11 when I started with the Schools Consent Project. And so I come to this not just from a professional perspective as a lawyer, but also someone who delivers consent workshops in schools, but also from that personal element of being a parent and knowing how difficult it can sometimes be and challenging to have these kinds of awkward conversations at home as well. I will start by just also acknowledging that I know Forest does such great work in terms of keeping you as parents and carers involved in the RSE and PSHE curriculums. I know you will have heard from, for example, the RAP project at some point, and your children will have experienced, at least some of them, our workshops as well. It's a great way to support not just students, but also all of you. And that joined up approach is really what matters in this conversation. First of all, and also a really brief trigger warning in many respects about the content. Of course, we're going to be talking about consent in terms of sexual relationships as well. I'm conscious that a lot of you are beaming in from home and you might actually have much younger children around. So I just wanted to flag that. I tend to do that and I won't know who's around. So I just want you to bear that in mind. I'll talk probably for about 45 minutes. Once I get carried away, sometimes it goes on for a bit longer, but I want to allow enough time for questions at the end and any comments that you might want to raise. Equally, if you have questions and comments as I'm going through, I'll try and keep an eye on my comments box so I can pick them up as I go through, but there will be some time at the end. I'm going to try and do my best to make sure there is time as well. The format, you'll see my slides, and as I go through, just so you know what the content is going to involve, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Schools Consent Project does and how we do it at various parts of this, not only so you know what we do, but also what the school is doing and what your young people might be learning through our workshops when they see us. But this is also a great way of giving you tips about how this conversation can be had outside of school and outside of our workshops as well. I often start with a number of questions at the beginning of each section of my talks, because a lot of it is about knowing why we need to have these conversations. And that's the backdrop of all of our pasts, but equally, mainly the last 24 months and what's been going on, not just in the media and in our big wide world, but also the mandated requirements on schools about what they are required to teach young people. The focus is going to be on you as parents and carers and families in supporting those. And I want this to be a really practical session as well. So I'll look at how we have those conversations as families, picking up on overcoming the challenges that we might face, concerns you might have in broaching the topic, and what to talk to our young people about and our children about in terms of healthy, intimate relationships, more specifically consent, and how we can do that, particularly when there are the tricky parts of the topic, including our hesitation sometimes, as well as our young people's hesitation in tackling it. This isn't a parenting seminar as such. I'm not here to tell you how to raise your children, but I am a parent, so I bring that experience into it from both perspectives as well. I'll start by, let me just make sure I'm doing that. Hopefully everyone can see that. Perfect. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Schools Consent Project very briefly. We are a charity. We were set up in 2015, so we've been running for a good 8-9 years now. And as Miss Arthur said, we are predominantly in the secondary school space. I'll add to that in recent months in particular, we have forayed into outside the school space, but also into adult spaces, because this is clearly a conversation that needs to be had, we believe, very much from an early age, but a conversation that needs to be had across the board. Our main aims are essentially to educate, engage, and empower. The education comes in knowing what the definitions are, often in legal terms, of consent. We cover off certain offences such as sexual assault, the sexting, nudes sharing, and rape offences as well. We look at communicating and identifying consent, bystander intervention, ages of consent, ways to respond to disclosures, where to go for help, for advice. So there's a whole remit of things that go with talking about consent. Our workshops are designed to be interactive, and that is because we know that's what works best. Young people really want to have their voices heard and to be able to use them as well, but also feel involved in those decision-making processes as well. So we do it through a lot of asking questions and playing games and looking at often what might be going on in the media and in the news at that particular point in time. But we often do those conversations through the lens of everyday consent, not just about sexual consent, because we know that consent underpins all of our relationships, not just the intimate ones. The younger the age groups are of the students we talk to, the more emphasis we put on things like bodily boundaries. And the older the groups are, generally speaking, the more legal it is. We find that the older groups tend to be far more interested in some of the legal aspects of what we talk about. Being inclusive, being appropriate in terms of developmental stages of where our young people are at is also really important. We use the language of the law. We talk about rights, we talk about responsibilities, and actually that is a hugely inclusive way of talking about things. We find that the law can allow itself to be talked about. We can have these consent conversations through a legal lens without even having to really talk about the law in any great detail, but it means that the conversation we have is relevant to every single person in that room, because the law in relation to consent applies to all of us, regardless of our gender identity, our religion, our race. And it also makes it a lot less finger pointy, and young people don't feel like we are being overly moralizing when we're talking about the subject as well. Ultimately, we are simply about having these conversations really early on, well before adulthood, which empowers everyone to express your boundaries, respect those boundaries, build those relationships, and help our children basically navigate their ways through what is effectively emotional immaturity when they're very, very young into adult relationships as well. Why do we do this? Why is it important to have these conversations around consent? Well, first of all, it works. Creating an environment where consent is spoken, learned about, we find will help prevent a lot of these cases where boundaries are overstepped from arising in the first place. It's a really big conversation, but we think that the consent education is the best way of challenging sexually harmful attitudes across society. Education is prevention. That's essentially our motto. And we think all children should learn about consent, about healthy relationships, about how to relate to other people. Those early ongoing conversations are super important because it gives children a solid framework. It empowers them to stay safe, help keep other people safe, but also develop healthy, intimate relationships which allow them to flourish in the long term. By educating ourselves, by educating others about consent, it gives us all, including the children we speak to, the tools they need and understanding to have agency, make those decisions for themselves in due course in an informed way. The we have to part is we genuinely have to have these conversations. The issues, the evidence around it, if you look at even just the past couple of years, but going back beyond that, from Jimmy Savile to the Me Too movement, to Sarah Everard, to the Everyone's Invited movement, we simply can't afford to ignore what the realities are of a world which is uneducated when it comes to consent and the truly awful consequences that can arise as a result. I'm not going to throw any statistics at you because actually the statistics are really, really horrible. And oftentimes it can get lost in the message of hope because we think that consent education is a really hopeful one. By having those conversations, we know things can change for the better. But having said all of that, you will know 2 years ago, Ofsted's rapid review report, which took place, it had some findings which were ultimately what they were saying is that we as adults in society often underestimate how prevalent and frequent a lot of those sexually harmful behaviors can be. The fact that a lot of those behaviors have become normalized, and for some children, a lot of those incidents are so commonplace, they don't even think about reporting it. And that feeds into one of my biggest concerns is the lack of reporting, the lack of telling someone about it, so that when a young person encounters an issue, they're afraid to, for various reasons, tell someone. And that means that they're not getting the help that they need. The other thing young people have told us regularly is that they feel that they don't have enough accurate knowledge and information. And those are all things that we together can definitely help them with and overcome. A really brief look at the Department for Education statutory guidance. This is what schools and school institutions are required now to make sure that the curriculum covers when it comes to relationships and sex education. It is a requirement. There's a lot of obligations there, and I'm focusing in on the ones that relate to consent, and particularly in terms of the law. But the regs are very clear about it. Pupils have to be taught about consent. This is what schools are being told. That concept of consent underpins all relationships, as I've said, and it isn't just about sex. It can be about respect. It's about kindness. It's about friendships. It has to be taught in a way that is factual. It has to be taught in a way which tells young people what their rights are, what their responsibilities are as citizens of this country. And it also requires the law to be taught in many places. And that's often where we step in terms of our workshops. We can provide that information, and we can arm them with really 100% accurate information when it comes to how the law is stated, but also how it might be applied as well. And it encourages all schools to make sure this is done in an age-appropriate way. I'm often a little hesitant at using words like age-appropriate because it kind of puts a number on it. What is a 12-year-old? What is a 16-year-old ready for? Or what do they need to know? But it is about stage-appropriate and developmentally appropriate, which can be linked to age sometimes. Having said all of that, it is remarkable that sometimes I will go into a school and talk to, let's say, year 8 pupils, so they're 12-year-olds. I come away learning so much more from that workshop than I feel I might have imparted, because they're clued up, they're streetwise, they're happy to talk about it. And equally, sometimes I'll go into sixth form sessions, and just that cohort just happens to be a group that they're not into parties. So all of those things that might be in our heads in terms of that is the stage at which they're at parties and alcohol might be involved and so on, isn't actually that much of a factor for them. Making sure something is developmentally appropriate also means preparing them before they find themselves in a situation where that information is going to be needed so that they can call upon it as well. But this is what the statutory guidance says, and that primary to secondary, what the guidance also says is that it has to be an ongoing seamless transition. So we start the conversations young and early, and we build on those as our young people grow up and as they start to experience different stages of their lives as well. So the idea is to have building blocks of healthy relationships in place. This is certainly not a one-off conversation. This is something that has to evolve as our children grow up and as they evolve, and we have to help them along with that as well. So schools will be doing the groundwork too, and as parents, families and carers, we can definitely help them with this along the way. I'm going to show you some of these quotes, and I'm not going to read them all out, but I'm going to show you these are quotes taken from a poll that was done by the Sex Education Forum. It's a few years old now, but essentially they spoke to something like 1,000 16 to 17-year-olds about what they felt when it came to parents talking to them about this issue. And you can see from these quotes that essentially young people are saying, we actually want our parents to have these conversations with us. I'll touch on the fact that when you do have those conversations with them, sometimes they're rolling their eyes or they're shutting you down or saying, I don't want to talk about it, or I've had enough. But the reality is they genuinely do want that information to come from sources which ultimately are trusted ones, and that's what we want for them as well. It's much better to give them accurate information rather than leave them feeling confused or misinformed. And the findings effectively tell us what we already knew, but possibly couldn't accept or face. But we know from talking to students in our workshops as well, is that they want this information. They want to be able to get it from a place which is reliable, and they want to grow up ultimately in a much safer, better society. They're articulating that need to us, and basically it's our responsibility as adults, as communities, to be able to provide that. Oftentimes, the who part of that is really important. This conversation, I said it at the outset, this isn't just a schools issue, it's a community-wide issue, and in fact, it's a global issue. It may or may not surprise you to know, you may find it reassuring, I sometimes do, that talking to schools, teachers, talking to students in far-flung places outside of the UK, and a lot of the issues are really, really similarly based across the world. So this is a conversation that needs to be had in so many different ways and in so many different environments. You will know your school is doing a job of trying to make sure that those conversations are being had in so many different ways, direct ways. It might be a consent workshop from us. It might be having the RAP project in. It might be having other organizations in. It might be their PSHE classes with a teacher, and they're having those conversations. And that is then going to be supplemented by you being able to help answer questions at home, but also knowing what your children are thinking about and learning about in that school space as well, because this isn't new. Those are huge responsibilities as well. And I think if there's anything I want you to take away from this, it is the fact that we're a team. All of us are a team, whether it's your teachers at school, whether it's you as families, whether it's me in my capacity as a workshop facilitator. We are a team and we can help each other out through this. And that applies to your friendship groups, your adult friendship groups as well. I thoroughly encourage, having those conversations with your friends, your family members as well, because you will realize that this is something that everyone is thinking about at some point on some level. And it is something that by talking to other people, you can find new and better ways of doing it, but also you can find some reassurance in knowing that there are some issues here which are common and there's a common thread around it. Equally, as I said at the outset, I genuinely believe, and the Schools Consent Project genuinely believes in positive messaging. It's about normalizing the positives. We get bombarded with quite a lot of negativity and a lot of negative messages, and our young people do too. And that can be about how not to do things. We're often doing that when we're raising our children, aren't we? We're saying, don't do that and don't do that. But actually normalizing the positive side of relationships, normalizing what consent looks like when it's healthy, normalizing what healthy communication actually looks like. What is a really fulfilling relationship? What does that look like? That is a really good, clear way of that message sitting with young people and giving us all some hope as to this is what we're aiming at, so that we've got something that we can build on as well. When it comes to the involvement of us as parents and as carers, as you can see there, we know that the biggest impact will come when everyone is involved in that conversation. And so as far as you're concerned, there are lots of ways in being involved in that conversation. Sometimes it is just about working out what is actually going on in our children's lives, but also in the wider world and in the world that they're living in. At the moment, the mainstream news around PSHE and relationships and sex education is seriously worrying. If you read everything that's been published in the last few days, sometimes in really mainstream media, actually, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the way our children are being taught about relationships and sex education is negative, but also is in some way dubious, or that there's something wrong with it. And those repeated media attacks on the way PSHE is being taught, my personal view is they're driven by political concerns and generally come from people who probably don't really know what is being taught in schools. So I'm going to caveat a lot of what you might read about what is being taught and any worries you might have about that with that as well. Equally, our own education is really important in that as well, so that as and when our young people do come to us and ask us questions, we feel confident in being able to answer their questions as well. When is the best time? I've touched on this already, so I'm not going to dwell on it. And it is a reframing sometimes of thinking about what is time appropriate for them. We need our young people to be ready, and we want to get them ready for that point in their lives when they're going to need that information and they're going to need that guidance already. And we need to also meet them where they're at. As a parent, I'm guilty of it too, of underestimating what stage my children might be at, what they may or may not have accessed or seen or heard or read about or know or be doing, for that matter, as well. And so I think talking about what's appropriate and not, it doesn't really matter. The point is, what is it that they need in order to be ready? They will be hearing words and seeing things from quite age. If you just look at music videos, for example, 3 clicks of a button on YouTube, and the latest song that everyone is listening to and the latest track everyone is listening to, the music video itself can be highly sexually explicit, and there seems to be no safeguard in place when they click through and they look up a song they like, for example. So sometimes it's inadvertent, that messaging can be coming through to them. And also they're curious. So they are going to look up things that they might not understand. And they might be thinking, well, I'm not sure I can ask anyone about that, so I'm just going to Google it. We're all guilty of doing that too. And that can pop up quite a few things as well. But we need to meet them where they are, and we need to come to terms with our own concerns about thinking that maybe they're too young for some of these conversations. Of course, the way we frame those conversations, it's really important that we frame them in a way that is appropriate for their developmental and age stages. When it comes to what our, overcoming those challenges, how do we as parents and carers and families have those conversations? Often our own hesitations can be in just how do I even bring this up and how do I approach it? It can also be around things like it can be a confidence thing, but it can also be a lack of knowledge thing. It can be, well, do I know enough to be able to have this conversation with them in a considered way, in a way that I can give them lots of information as well? And sometimes there's embarrassment. I mean, that is very common, and that's both ways, right? Our children are going to feel that way as well in having these conversations with us. The other thing is the innocence element, but I have touched on that. You know, their innocence. Am I overly worrying them if I start bringing up conversations about certain things as well? And as I said, we are underestimating often the maturity of our young people, but also their experience. The other thing that I would say is information and knowledge, when it's appropriately passed on and accurately passed on, isn't going to taint anyone's innocence. They are no less innocent for having the information. It actually teaches them that you're prepared to talk about it, shows them that you are someone that they can turn to for help and support should they need it at any point in their lives. So bringing the conversation up, that opening of that door is super important as well. There was some research commissioned, I think, by the British Board of Film Classification not that long ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, and very recently the Children's Commissioner this year has published 2 reports which are eye-opening in many respects, but also really clear, and they both touch on the issue of pornography and the point at which our young people have accessed it and seen it. I'm going to check my note for statistics on this so I get them right. But the Children's Commissioner found that the average age at which children first see pornography is 13. And actually, by the age of 9, 10% of the young people that the Children's Commissioner had surveyed and talked to had seen pornography. I mean, that is a ludicrous statistic in many respects as well. And we are talking about not just the kind of imagery that we might have grown up knowing about and occasionally seeing, where it was printed and it was on the top shelf in a magazine covered in a plastic wrapper. Now there is super easy access, and the actual content they're seeing, it's not even just pictures, for example. You know, that video imagery that can be seen, which can be highly graphic as well and very easily accessed, was something that growing up, certainly, I don't think there was no internet, there was no online, so you had to physically go somewhere and get a video, or somebody had to give you that kind of material in a very physical sense. So that access is very, very much far more available to them. But I'm putting those challenges up there because I fully appreciate the issues and concerns and hesitations we might have about having this conversation in the first place. So then how do we have that conversation? This is the important part, and this is the nitty-gritty of it all. I think we need to reframe our perspective on things. We need to stop worrying about shielding our children from bad things and protecting their innocence, to education and empowerment, because education empowers them. It enables them and us actually to feel comfortable, to feel confident about the world we live in, but also about having the conversation in the first place. So these are the tips I would give you about, what you might want to think about in terms of before you start broaching the subject, but also what might your concerns be and how you can overcome them. What is your concern? Because sometimes it might be that it's about thinking about what makes you feel awkward or uncomfortable about it. Sometimes it's words and language. How am I going to phrase it? How am I going to say it? Sometimes it's, what if I can't answer the questions that my child asks me? And then think about how you overcome that. The reality is, when it comes to words, language, answering questions, this is not uncommon in the workshops. I'd say that the first workshop I ever delivered, I was a lawyer, so I was very used to talking to adults. I could stand up in a courtroom and I could argue a case in front of a judge. But talking to a 14-year-old about this and answering their questions, whole different ballgame. So my first workshop probably involved me feeling internally really quite anxious about having to answer those questions. And they weren't my children, as it were. To some extent, that made me feel even more anxious because I had this grave responsibility of other people's children. But ultimately, what I had to do to overcome that was actually just think about it. Think about the kinds of things that they might ask me, they might bring up, words they might use. How am I going to respond to that? And how am I going to practice? And I practiced saying a lot of those words out loud in a super normal, matter-of-fact way, and using that language. And that way I could, at least until I became really confident on the inside, saying it that way, I could put up the veneer of feeling really confident about it as well. The point about asking and answering is that this is a topic where there's no rule book. Everyone is individual, and everyone's personal preferences and choices can be really, really varied. And so the questions that they ask you, you might not know an answer to. And that's true of a lot of things. We might not know the answers to it, but also getting comfortable with the fact that we don't always know all the answers is also okay. And being able to say that with honesty sometimes, I don't actually know the answer to that myself, because it's not something I've thought about, or I've not considered it, or I've not come across it before, I've not experienced it myself. And it's actually okay to be able to say that every so often. Preparing and practice, like I've covered that, it's like sometimes it's just having the conversation with yourself and thinking about it. If you're worried, is this going to come out wrong? People who talk about the same topic a lot just become comfortable with it, right? If you're a physics teacher and you plan your lesson and then you spend years delivering a lesson in a particular way, you're going to get really comfortable with it and you're not going to need to worry about it quite so much. So being able to talk about it also teaches your children that those conversations, those questions about sex, about relationship, sometimes about abuse, are not just acceptable, but they're normal, and they're really, really helpful. Keeping that conversation going is also a really important one. If you are lucky enough to be able to find yourself in a conversation with your child because there's something that's been on the radio, or because they've attended a workshop at school, right? And they might come home and say, oh, this crazy lady came in and talked to me about consent and the law. And they might have that conversation with you. Sometimes trying to keep the conversation going will actually make you feel more confident about it as well. You can also acknowledge the fact that there may be an awkwardness and an embarrassment, both in terms of the child and young person you're speaking to, but by yourself as well. And remember that they're probably going to be a little bit embarrassed about that subject, particularly if you are as well. Open-ended questions is a really useful technique, and we use it quite a lot in most of our workshop content as well. It's asking a question in a way that, one, it actually tells your child that you're quite interested in what they think about it. It also helps you establish what they might already know or think they know about it before you give your view of it or answer a question about it. I had a parent ask me in one of these seminars ages ago, and it was actually a primary school age child who had asked them, what is an orgasm? I think was the word that I think that's the question that was asked. And the parent said to me, I didn't know how to answer that. And also, like, what would your tip be about that? And I said, I think my first response to that would be to ask them what they think it meant, because it may just be something that they've heard in a playground. It may be something they do kind of know what it is. And gauging what their level of understanding is first will always inform how you have that conversation with that person at that point in time. Being honest is super helpful. Children, most people, but children in particular, and teenagers especially, they will know if you lie to them. They can tell. They've got a brilliant radar for it. But equally, it's okay to be honest, to say, I don't know. Or if a topic gets too much, or you start getting into a very serious territory of conversation, they might find it's getting too much or becoming awkward. And then it's okay. You can just pause and say, you know what? Let's change the topic. Let's move on to something else, and we'll come back and have this conversation another time. And being honest if you don't know something is really important too. It's okay, because it's a way of modeling your own vulnerabilities. It's okay not to know something, and you can say, I don't know, but you know what? I can find out, or let's work this out together, or let's find it out together as well. Listening and giving them time is about sometimes needing to stay quiet and not having to fill the silence every time. It may just be that that your child is just thinking about something, or getting the courage to speak up about something, or thinking about asking a question and how they're going to ask it as well. And offering different ways of communicating with you. You will know your own child, and you'll know them well enough to know if they don't want to engage with you in the conversation, which you might have just started, or that the conversation is coming to an end, which they might have started, but they definitely don't want to go any further than that. But there are loads of other ways in which you can encourage that form of communication to continue. With really super young children, sometimes I say to parents, they can draw you a picture even to continue that conversation. With older children, it might just be they can send you a message. They might actually just text you. But my children, particularly when they're a little bit younger, used to find it really difficult to say certain words, particularly when it came to anatomy, and they'd whisper them or they'd spell them out. And so there are lots of different ways in which to offer them different ways to communicate with you as well. Ultimately, if you can stay calm, answer questions honestly, accurately to the extent you can, and unashamedly, which might include saying, I don't know the answer to that right now, but let me get back to you, or let's look it up. Your children are much more likely to respond better to the rest of the subject that you're talking about as well. And essentially, these are all the ways in which we approach our workshops. I've thrown this slide in just to let you know some tips around the conversations we have. Our content covers all of these aspects of talking about consent, from what is consent to communicating it to thinking about disclosures and safeguarding related issues, which I'll touch on in a moment as well. And there are so many different ways in which to approach the conversation. But I'll give you a few tips about how we do it in our workshops as well. When it comes to, for example, language, we use definitions, and we actually use legal definitions, which is a super helpful way of talking about things. But we also use very accurate language, and sometimes the young people we speak to don't necessarily have the language to articulate something. And if they've heard you as an adult use the correct anatomical body part, for example, word for it, then they will feel comfortable at some point if they ever need to. So that sometimes involves just using the correct names for genitals, right? That's about building language and confidence to talk about your body, their bodies, and it forms a very protective function. Some research was done about, the fact that sometimes young people, I did this. So when my children were very, very young, for body parts, we didn't use, and I'm trigger warning in case there are really young people around, we use different pseudonyms for different things. So we'd say winky instead of penis, just as an example. But interspersed with that, when I was talking about something specific about a bodily function, I'd make sure I used the word penis at some point. And that way, it's perfectly okay to have your nicknames for things, but also knowing that really accurate word for how to describe something would mean that at some later stage, just a health concern arises, right? And then they've got to talk to a doctor about it. That's how they would be able to articulate it. So getting our language and getting comfortable with our language is really important as well. Asking is one of the things we cover in our workshops as well. We want to make it really normal and really comfortable for everyone to be able to ask their partners about what they want, what they don't want. And the flip side of that is becoming really comfortable with being able to say what we want and what we don't want, and being able to verbalize it, but also show it in lots of different ways. And so having that language to do it, asking is one of those things we often cover in our workshops by using everyday examples outside of a sexual intimate context. So a lot of our games that we play, the examples we use or the scenarios we use, completely unrelated to anything to do with relationships in that sphere. We use an ice cream buying and selling scenario, for example, to make everyone realize that actually this is a super easy thing to do. We do it all the time, every day. We can ask a friend, can I have some chips off your plate? They look really tasty, right? We're really comfortable with it. And when we put it back into an intimate context, sometimes people feel awkward and uncomfortable, but actually it doesn't need to be. So that verbalizing of how we do that is also really, really important. But ultimately, it's about listening to them, telling them how these things can be done, sometimes showing them, demonstrating, that was a really good indication of a communication, which was about someone asking and checking and then following through and responding accordingly to what that person answered, and then letting them have a go and practice it as well. Communication is always a two-way thing as well. It's about speaking up and listening, but also paying attention and responding accordingly. When it comes to I do have it there. When it comes to what should we be talking about in terms of the concept of consent and the whole topic of consent, as I've said, everyday examples of consent are really useful. So it is about using examples as and when you're going through like daily chores. It's about, do you want to have peas or do you want to have cauliflower? Right? That's a really common question to ask, and it's a really simple way of showing that I'm agreeing to have these peas put on my plate or not put on my plate. And it is very much about using everyday examples if you can. You're probably having consent conversations often without realizing and recognizing it. We also really want to encourage listening, and often the way we do it is by listening ourselves. So if your child feels that they're going to be listened to and heard, and we don't have to agree, we often say that we can all have really differing views and opinions on many different things, we don't have to agree, but we do have to listen respectfully to what other people are saying and what we are saying. And equally, that works both ways. Sometimes it's about actually respecting the young people in our lives and respecting their views and opinions, even if we disagree with them, and sometimes vehemently disagree with them as well. Not being really uncomfortable with talking about difficult topics. And I've listed just a few there because they're the topics that often can be really, really difficult and challenging to talk about. We find it challenging to talk about them sometimes in our workshops. Andrew Tate and the conversation around that we found has been really difficult to have in a way which is both respectful, and that's respect between the peer groups and people in that classroom. People have very, very strong views about it, but also in terms of the messages and how do we unpick some of the things that are going on. Pornography. Our young people are not going to come and tell us if they've seen something awful and horrific if they are worried that, one, we don't want to talk about it, or there's a taboo around the topic itself, but two, that they're somehow going to get into trouble because somehow they've accessed something, no matter how that is. And so being able to acknowledge that is a different conversation, but being able to talk about the topic is really important as well. Finding out what is going on in their lives, but also in their peer groups' lives. I often try and make my questions really broad. So when I was when my children, both of them, but certainly my older child, who is a boy, when he got his phone before starting secondary school, and then a year had gone by, and I was looking into a lot of the stats around sexting, the sharing of nudes, because it's become so commonplace, so normalized amongst young people. What I wanted to know was, is this happening? Are you seeing stuff pop up on your phone? Are you involved in it in some way? And asking that direct question is definitely going to cause a shutdown on the conversation. And I'm definitely not going to get any honesty out of it. But asking it in a really broad sense of the word, like I've read this, or I've heard that. This is a really common phenomenon, and it can probably be quite scary if like something unwanted just pops up on your phone and it doesn't seem normal. But is this something that's happening in your year group? And then you've made it a whole broad thing. It's not an individual thing, certainly not to your child, but not even to their friendship groups. So finding out, is this something that is an issue, also just opens that door. It means that you don't have to have a whole conversation about it going on from that, unless you're both willing to do that and you're both engaged in it. But it opens the door and allows you to come back to it at a later stage if you need to. And it just means you're finding out about it. And safe adults. I think it's really important for every one of us, but also every young person, to know that there is an adult in their lives who they can pretty much come to around these issues. And I always like to think I'm that safe adult for my children, but just the mere fact of a relationship of a parent and child can make that really difficult. I'm probably one of their safe adults. I hope I am, but it's just making them aware that there are so many places that they can go to access information, help, and advice at any point, but making it really clear that, you know, you are also there. You're happy to listen to them. You're happy to talk things through with them as well, and trying to keep that conversation possibility at least alive as well. Okay, I'm really conscious that it's now 1:45, and I definitely want to leave time for comments and questions at the end as well. I want to finish on the support for you aspect of it as well. This is it can feel like a really scary topic to even talk about, but also the consequences when something goes wrong in our children's lives. It can be really scary as well. Just remember that you might need to talk to someone as well about this, and think about who is your safe person that you can talk to about this as well. There is a lot of support available for parents out there in different formats, but sometimes it's not very joined up. And I would say I've spoken to many people. Just given what I do, I am on the receiving end of disclosures outside of a school space, particularly, and I've been speaking to a parent and putting together almost like a handy sheet of information. If something has happened to your child, you as a parent are going to find that really, really difficult as well. And coming up with where do you go to for that help and advice is something that's really important and something to think about. But there are lots of places to do that, and I suspect that support will be available to you, certainly from school, so that is somewhere you can go to as well. But just in terms of the wider world, there are independent sexual violence advisors who are brilliant, and just typing in ISVA, can be a really useful place to go to, because they can help navigate a family through any issues that have come up as well. I'm conscious I've ended on a really serious note there, and that's not where I wanted to go with this, but ultimately I'm going to go back to right at the beginning when I said this is something that is a conversation we should all be having. I don't know the last time any of you had a conversation with an adult in your life about relationships and consent, but it's a conversation that can be really challenging. And all the young people I speak to, I'm honestly awed by their openness in wanting to have this conversation. So it isn't as hard as you might think it is as a parent to have that conversation with them. This was certainly not an exhaustive review, and I've definitely gone off-piste on many of the slides there, I'm sure. It is also normal for it to feel quite overwhelming to have this conversation, but it's not something to be feared. We live in a society where our children are kind of bombarded, actually, with messages about sex, sexuality, harm, porn, and we haven't quite developed that strong culture we need where we talk to our children about these topics, and we need to work on that. So sometimes children are exposed to what might be adult material, but adult conversations at quite an early age, and we can't just pretend that our children have never heard it, never seen it, or experienced it. It's better to assume in many respects that they might be or have already been exposed to it, and that way we can make sure education and support is always available as well. And as our children grow, we know that they need to know we're a source of trusted, reliable, accurate knowledge. Otherwise, if we don't fill that gap, they're going to go seek it out from peers, from online sources. And whilst there's lots of useful information there as well, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation there as well. This all brings up quite a lot of new learning for us. It's common for adults to have quite low levels of knowledge on lots of topics. And many of us, I certainly had very little relationships and sex education growing up. I was also brought up in a family where we didn't really talk about these topics. So it's very common for us to feel daunted by it and not have that information. And also be reassured, we won't always get it right. You know, there'll be those moments, where did I go wrong? Just trust the groundwork that you put in just by having snippets of the conversation or giving little bits of information and advice to your children. It'll all be in there somewhere, and it will filter through at some point. I'm going to say thank you all so much for listening. I'm just looking at the comments right now to make sure if there are any questions going through. And if there aren't, I will say good night to you. I won't jump off straight away. So if anyone wants to take a minute to type in a question or comment, please do. And I will say good night otherwise to those of you who are heading off for dinner. So thank you so much for your time.